Welcome in, Draft Nicks. It's another edition of Draft Nation. I'm Chris Mack with you. And don't forget, draftnation.com is the place to be. Mock drafts getting posted all the time. I just threw a new one up middle of this week. Cole Musio. You got JT Toth putting up prospect profiles as well. Keeping an eye on what's happening at the collegiate level. Because it feels like now, with just a couple of weeks left in the collegiate regular season, and we're about 2/3 of the way through the NFL season, that someone poured a big old can of kerosene on what will become the mock draft season over the course of the next now 5 months or so. And who better to talk about all that? It's been a few weeks since we've talked to him anyway, than our guy from CBS Sports, Ryan Wilson. Ryan, thanks for taking the time today, man. I really appreciate it.
Chris, good to see you, buddy. How's it going?
It's good. Like I said, it feels like, probably because we've started to see, we see a GM dismissed in New York, which we can get into. We see some teams that are just clearly out of it now, like big name teams and Dallas included. And you start to see the kind of moves, the other team in New York, for instance, saying, yeah, we're done with that quarterback now. In Daniel Jones, you see the kind of moves that start to set things up for next year already in some places. So naturally, the old mock draft atmosphere has become enriched starting right here in the middle of November already, before we even get to Thanksgiving. And I want to go through some of the ones in the top 5 to 10 of your first round mock that came out earlier this week in a couple of minutes. But right before we jumped on to have this conversation, out came the news that Shedeur Sanders is planning on going to the East-West Shrine Bowl after the collegiate season is over. And that is interesting. You've got the Shrine Bowl, you've got the Senior Bowl. They both try to attract as many high-end prospects as they can, but then it's a matter of convincing them to actually play in those games as well. This is interesting to me that Shedeur Sanders will be headed to the Shrine game rather than, I guess, the Senior Bowl.
Yeah. So Shrine typically happens the weekish before Senior Bowl. And when you're at the Senior Bowl, you typically see the scouts coming in on Tuesday, maybe Wednesday morning, because of the overlap with the Shrine Bowl. And historically, the last 4 or 5 years, Aiden O'Connell played in the Shrine Bowl. Brock Purdy played in the Shrine Bowl in terms of quarterbacks. And then, of course, when you get to the Senior Bowl, you're getting the guys that are typically first-round picks. Justin Herbert was there. Jalen Hurts was there in that same class. He was a second-round pick. Kenny Pickett, Malik Willis, all those guys were in the class together with Des Ridder a few years ago. So this is a huge get. And, you and I were chatting before. This is post-NIL, so you're not paying these guys either way. But sometimes there are conversations that you are right or wrong. But if you're making $6 million a year, Shedeur Sanders, I don't know if an extra couple bucks in the tip jar is going to sway you one way or the other. But the bigger issue is the one that you point out, because the guys that go to the Shrine Bowl get drafted and the guys that go to the Senior Bowl get drafted. It's just a matter of where. So the competition is there. But the other thing is Shedeur even going to work out? A couple years ago, Zay Flowers was at the Shrine Bowl, first-round pick, Ravens' best receiver, one of the best young receivers in the NFL. He didn't work out that week. I don't remember if it was because of injury or just because of his choice. He did talk to teams. He did the interviews, did those things that are also incredibly important in terms of the overall draft process. But this is fun, man. And this is fun because this isn't last year's draft class where we had the 6 quarterbacks go in the first round. And let me see. Bo Nix and Spencer Rattler were at the Senior Bowl last year. Caleb didn't do anything. Jaden didn't do anything. Drake May didn't do anything. I'm just trying to go through my mental Rolodex here.
Yeah.
So this year you have Cam and you have Shedeur, Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders as the bona fide 2 guys going in the first round. We can talk ourselves into some other guys if we have to. So for one to go to the Shrine Bowl, we'll see where Cam ends up. That's fun. And look, I'd like the idea of making it more All-Star games more important.
Yeah.
And the other thing is I've been trying for a couple of years to get CBS Sports to the Shrine Bowl. So maybe this will be the impetus that gets us there. We're typically at the Senior Bowl, but I love the idea. The more players you can see in person, the better. Get a chance to talk to them and see who they are.
Let's put a button on the quarterback conversation. And it's not really going to totally tie it up with a pretty little bow, because there's plenty to talk about in regards to the quarterback prospects. But I saw your latest mock had a third quarterback sneaking in the last third of the first round. It was Jalen Milroe. And it feels like Milroe and Ewers, maybe Carson Beck, if he can put some things together here in the last couple of weeks and Georgia can go on a run in the playoff, might be the other ones that are kind of sitting right on the precipice of that late first round, second day tier of quarterbacks. Just, do you see any reason to believe that could be shaken up really very much in the final, depending on how many games some of these teams play, 2 to 5, maybe 6 games these teams play?
So realistically, and I do with the First Pick Draft podcast with Rick Spielman, the former Vikings general manager, and he asked me the Jalen Milroe question yesterday. He said, "Are you saying that Jalen Milroe is a better passer than Anthony Richardson? Because athletically, in terms of running straight line, they're probably pretty similar. Mm-hmm. Anthony's bigger. He's not a better passer, so you have to do a lot of squinting to talk yourself into taking him into the first round and hoping that you can get Anthony Richardson type production when he's at his best out of Jalen Milroe. And, the old saying, hope ain't a plan, certainly applies here. So if Carson Beck, of the guys we're talking about, Carson Beck, probably for me, if he can ball out the next 4 or 5 weeks, he's going to help himself the most. Jalen Milroe is more runner than thrower right now. He's in the Kalen DeBoer offense, which we saw the things that Kalen and Michael Penix Jr. were able to do the last 2 years in Washington. And Penix at Indiana was more runner than thrower, and he certainly evolved as the injuries piled up and he needed to do more things from the pocket. He is still a good athlete. Part of me thinks, a large part of me, Chris, is that Carson Beck should come back. Jalen Milroe should come back. Garrett Nussmeier should come back. I think Quinn Ewers might finally be out of eligibility. I'm sure they're ready to move on to Arch anyway. Yeah. But he's probably going to be a day 2 guy as we sit here. But I think the persons, plural, that can help themselves most with balling out in terms of what an NFL quarterback should look like, a Carson Beck who finally played well, and Jalen Milroe who has to prove that he can be more consistent from the pocket with his arm.
That's an interesting idea because that could really widen the gulf. If all those guys decided, and like you said, I think Ewers, whether he's done at Texas or just done in college, is being pushed out by Arch Manning. But that could really widen that gulf between the top tier and the next tier. If you get all 3 of those SEC quarterbacks going back for another year, I imagine Drew Aller goes back for another year.
Hopefully.
Because I think he needs it as well. I mean, that offense, when it's worked for Penn State, it's been great, but it's been all about Tyler Warren this year, which means you're going to go from Sanders and Ward at the top, maybe Ewers right behind them, all the way down to like your Kyle McCords and Miller Mosses of the world.
And Miller Moss is coming back too because he got benched. He'll probably have to transfer. There's been some scuttlebutt that maybe Michigan might be a good landing spot for him. So, yeah, and the funny thing, it's funny you say that because Kyle McCord and Miller Moss in weeks 1 through 3, I was like, oh my gosh, these guys are going to work themselves to top 100 picks the way they're playing. Mm-hmm. You saw the Pitt game. Kyle McCord came crashing back down to earth, and I think he went about 10 or 20 feet deep into the earth after that game. Yeah. Miller Moss has since been benched. So there is going to be a gap after Quinn Ewers, and I'll check real quick if these guys go back that I talk about. But last year, remember, Bo Nix went 12, and then we didn't see Spencer Rattler to the 5th round. I thought Spencer should have been probably late day 2, and didn't work out, but it is what it is. So then you talked about Aller coming back, Riley Leonard. He hasn't, right. Yeah, he's a great athlete.
The face I just made, for those of you not watching the video, was like I just tasted some bad mayonnaise. That was the Riley Leonard face.
And there's no real good mayonnaise, so the mayonnaise would have just sufficed.
No. How about a garlic aioli, Ryan? Could I convince you on that with like some sweet potato fries, maybe?
So there's Will Howard. Again, he's okay, but he's not. He's a day 3 guy. Yeah. Dylan Gabriel's balling out, but he's 5'11", and he's been in college football for 50 years. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there's going to be a huge chasm after we get past if those guys go back after we get past Quinn Ewers, and maybe that pushes Quinn up a little bit.
The one name you didn't mention amongst all those quarterbacks, and we will pivot to the top quarterback here and the entire industrial complex that's being built around Shedeur Sanders in just a second, but you didn't mention Jackson Dart, and I'm curious. Is that because I don't, does he have any eligibility left, or is he in a spot where he's got to leave, or I can't imagine Lane Kiffin is interested if Jackson Dart wants to play another year and having him transfer out. I mean, this is a guy who, given the way he played last year, given the way he played early this year, I would think if he can put it together again during a possible Ole Miss playoff run, that would kind of launch him up into a day around 2-ish, 3-ish pick?
Yeah, that was an oversight on my part because Jackson Dart's had a pretty good season. I do wonder about his arm strength. He's a little bit bigger and maybe a little better athlete than Matt Corral was. And I sort of lumped them two together, obviously, because of Ole Miss. They both were number 2, and they do similar things in that. And the other thing is the funkiness of the Lane Kiffin offense makes it hard sometimes to evaluate quarterbacks, wide receivers, to get an idea of what they're doing. I mean, Jonathan Mingo played in that offense, and he was okay, and it hasn't quite translated. And Carolina got traded to the Cowboys. They have Trey Harris, who's a really good player. He's been injured at wide receiver as well, but he's put up some huge numbers. But yeah, Jackson Dart to me feels like probably third round if you're really making a move. I think he's better than Matt Corral coming out. It has less of the off-field concerns that Matt had that affected his draft stock as well. So yeah, no, that's a good point. I'd be surprised if he came back, but I think he's a good number 2 that you look forward to perhaps what his NFL career might look like.
Definitely interesting, though, with all those SEC programs maybe being disappointed in how they're going to get placed this year or missing the playoff possibility in some cases, what it means for the quarterbacks at those programs and their ability to come back, like you said, given NIL as well. It's a possibility.
Hey, one thing quickly, Matt, Chris, as I'm looking through this, and I should mention this, Curtis Rourke out of Indiana.
Yeah.
And we watched him last year when he was I think he was at Miami, Ohio before he transferred. And I was like, okay, he's pocket passer, doesn't do anything great. We watched him again this earlier in the year, and he forced some balls I didn't love. But that team is balling out, and they're balling out, and he's putting up huge numbers. So they play Ohio State this weekend. So that could be a guy that continues to make a case for himself and maybe works himself into a conversation where he goes higher than I'm giving him credit for right now. So I'm interested to go back and watch him and see how he does this weekend. So I wanted to put his name on the radar as well because he's had as good a season as anyone.
No, that's a great call. I'm glad you mentioned him because, like you said, Ohio State this weekend, if he plays well, even if it's in a loss, and then presumably a playoff game, maybe 2 on their schedule as well. We'll see how that plays out. But if Rourke is part of them going deeper into the postseason than a lot of people expect, and definitely a guy who will raise his stock as well. All right, Shedeur Sanders. There's a number of different dynamics going into what I've jokingly called the Sanders industrial complex here, but we've got Deion saying he's put a kickstand down at Colorado. Isn't it right now publicly entertaining the idea of moving on to the NFL, but there are plenty of insiders who are flouting that as a theory right now that he could end up somewhere. Dallas, where everything is imploding and Mike McCarthy will undoubtedly be done at the end of the year, is one thought. The Raiders will be looking. That's undoubtedly a thought. And coincidentally, maybe not, every time the Raiders lose, Shedeur Sanders tweets out, "Thank God," in all caps the same day. So, look, I am like Charlie Day in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia with the board behind me here, drawing all the lines. Yeah. And lots of people are going to do that for the next few months regarding Shedeur and Deion and their futures and whether they could possibly be tied together. I still see him being mocked number 2 in most drafts behind his teammate, Travis Hunter. I see you've got him there as well, only it would be in a mock trade where the Giants would move up to get him. Just let's start with Shedeur, and is he worth what is going to, I imagine, become a feeding frenzy to get him as the first quarterback off the board in the top 5 of this year's draft?
Despite the mock draft that you mentioned that I put out on Monday, Cam Ward's my QB1.
Okay.
For the purposes of the conversation, that mock draft, I just had Shedeur going right before him. Then the reason is this: Cam's a little bigger, Cam's has a better arm, and Cam's a better athlete. The issue with both quarterbacks, and if we're talking about comparing to last year's draft class, they're probably no better than QB4 or QB5. And if we all knew Bo Nix was going to play this well,
right?
Talking primarily to myself, then maybe QB6.
No, I'm right there with you. I did not think in a million years it would work this well with Peyton in the first year.
I don't want to crap on the young man because he is playing well, but I went back and we watched most of their games when we talk about these rookie quarterbacks on the podcast. He had some of the cleanest pockets and he throws mostly short and intermediate routes. He's executing what he's being asked to do. So that's it on Bo Nix. Congratulations that he's doing what he's doing. But again, surprisingly for me. So if we're talking about Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders as QB 4, 5, or 6 in last year's draft class, then by definition, we're talking about overreaching for them if we're taking a top 5 here because Bo Nix went 12th last year. That said, the teams we're talking about here, the Giants, the Browns, the Raiders, maybe even the Titans, depending on where they land on Will Levis, they all need quarterbacks, and they may have to trade up to get them. And if you're the Jacksonville Jaguars, by the way, somehow a more embarrassing outfit than the Cowboys as we sit here, you're hoping that someone wants to trade up for one of these quarterbacks, or maybe even Travis Hunter. You don't care. Jacksonville, I had them taking Travis Hunter because it makes sense, but Trent Baalke, the GM, goes against the grain a lot of times. I mean, they took Trevon Walker first overall. So if they're interested in moving down to getting a big guy and they like to get big bodies, whether it's on defense or offense, that's also something they would be willing to entertain, I'd imagine. The thing with Shedeur and Cam is this. They need to play on time more consistently, and we've seen how that has affected Caleb Williams. He looked better last week with Thomas Brown as the OC. So there's a lot of hero ball going on, in part because it needs to happen on the offenses they're on, but that doesn't translate week in and week out in the NFL. So less hero ball, more playing on time, and I think that would be in their best interest. But I get it. Sometimes it's hard to shake those sort of things. I like Cam a little better just because of the athleticism, and we see week in and week out in the NFL that if you have an athletic quarterback, it solves a lot of problems. Mac Jones went 15th overall. You and I could outrun him in a foot race, and that has sort of played itself out in terms of how his career's gone.
Yeah.
Look at Justin Herbert the other day. By the way, Joe Burrow might be one of the toughest people on planet Earth. That game against playing Justin Herbert, he took, by my count, 750 hits. And he's he's a way better athlete than we give him credit for. But those are the type of things that translate. Pocket passing, like I do wonder, like, well, how would Peyton Manning be in today's NFL given how athletic the edge rushers are, no matter how smart he is?
Might not have survived his first year, let alone
That's the other
long
thing, right?
enough to break an NFL interception record for rookies.
It might have been his best interest in year one, at least.
Yeah. So this is what's interesting, because as we look at the current construction of the top 5 or top 10 picks as they would lay out right now, it would go Jacksonville, Tennessee, Cleveland, Giants, Vegas in the top 5. And there would certainly, and your mock indicates this, and I think it's, again, given the hype around Sanders and where his father may or may not end up in all of this and how he may try to influence this, there's going to be some maneuvering going on, because I can't imagine if you're Jacksonville, you're tied at the hip to Trevor Lawrence for at least the next few years. If you're Tennessee, you've made a lukewarm commitment to Will Levis, even though, speaking of mayonnaise, you can't get him to do the smart thing and stop putting it in his coffee, let alone throwing football sideways.
He is the mayonnaise of young quarterbacks.
That's the great Will Levis, the man. That is so wildly on point and appropriate. Will Levis, the mayonnaise of young quarterbacks in the NFL. But then you get Cleveland third, and we're not sure what their level of ability is to maneuver away from Deshaun Watson at this point, let alone desire to do so, given that, there's always a chance that Cleveland may just decide to lean all in on the mistake. The Giants at 4 and Vegas at 5 seem to be the two that would be most interested in moving up and having that sort of arms race for Shedeur Sanders, if that's who it's for. Just how messy do you think this might get in the top 5? I know we're still, 7 months out from this thing.
156 days.
Thank you. The counter it's like a deli counter on the other side of Ryan's camera right now. You can't see it, but he knows exactly how many days until the draft. How messy could this get at the top, given the possibility that Dion and the Sanders family insert themselves into this? But then you've also got the opportunity for teams who may end up walking away from this thing with a better evaluation, like you, on Cam Ward than Shedeur Sanders.
Yeah, so a couple of caveats to start, and I'll put the question on you. Number one, Tom Telesco, the GM of Las Vegas, does not trade up or down. Like, he just stays put and takes guys. Maybe that changes with Tom Brady now involved and in a new organization. He was with the Chargers for a long time. Number one. Number two, let me ask you this. Who would you rather have if you're the Raiders? Would you rather have Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders or Justin Fields, who will be a free agent at the end of the year?
Oh, my. There's something about the ability to have a guy with a clean slate. But there's also something about the idea of the ceiling. God, I feel like that's Justin Fields' middle name at this point in his career.
Yeah.
The ceiling of Justin Fields getting the ability to maybe work with Tom Brady. That's that's something, because I think we've seen Fields show the ability to rein in the mistake-prone football that he was playing with in Chicago in the first 6 weeks in Pittsburgh. The question is how much farther is he from that ceiling, and can Tom Brady get him to effectively smash his head up against it in fulfilling all of his promise? I think that's a wonderful question. I would be more attuned to taking the clean slate, as long as it didn't come with fatherly baggage and Shador or Cam in that case. But it's an interesting proposition if you put it that way.
As we sit here, Justin Fields is going to be QB1 on the free agent market. There aren't a lot of names out there. They're the Jacoby Brissetts and the Andy Daltons.
Yeah.
Not a lot of young names. I would imagine Russ Wilson will probably get re-upped in Pittsburgh, given the way he's played. So that's the math that these teams at the top are going to have to do as well. But to your point, if you don't think you can get the most out of Justin Fields, or when you evaluated him coming out of Ohio State, you weren't crazy about him, you may go in another direction. I do wonder, and the things that Coach Prime said about his son on a podcast last week, I can't remember the podcast, but basically I'm going to have some say. I'll do it behind the scenes. I won't be waving my arms about publicly saying he's not going here, not going there. That's essentially what the Mannings did when Eli said, I ain't going to San Diego at the time. One of my favorite pictures ever in NFL draft history is when he was drafted by the Chargers and he had hold that
Chargers jersey
next to Paul Tagliabue, and he just looked like he ate a mayonnaise sandwich. But it worked out, right? So I think it's very similar to that. There just wasn't social media back then to amplify that message,
right?
And I'm okay with that. Would you want your son going to play for the Browns, knowing everything that's dysfunctional about the Browns? No. And it doesn't have to be a big media market, from my perspective. Maybe they feel that way, the Sanders do. But if he was going to a situation where there was a stable coaching staff and they had a plan for young players, and I was talking to Rick Spielman about this last week when the Bears fired their offensive coordinator Shane Waldron. I said, "Okay, so look, when you're interviewing these guys, because it was clear pretty early on this wasn't going to work, what is the most important thing that an offensive coordinator has to do with a young player?" And he's like, "Well, they have to have a plan." I said, "Well, clearly he sold the plan to the Bears that wasn't true for a number of reasons, but that's got to be critical." We talk about it all the time. Bobby Slowick and C.J. Stroud, Cliff Kingsbury and what he's doing with Jane Daniels, Arthur Smith and what he did with Justin Fields, and now Russ Wilson. It doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to be effective. And I think that's the most important thing. So if we're going down the list with that, and we're talking about Brian Daboll and the Giants, Kevin Stefanski's a great offensive coordinator, but the dysfunction of that place is through the roof terrible. And then the Raiders. And I think to your point, you put a little faith in Tom Brady having an idea of what might be best for a young quarterback. Of those three, oddly enough, and the Raiders might be getting a new coach, I think I feel the best about the Raiders, and then maybe the Giants, because I like what Brian Daboll was able to do with Josh Allen back in the day, and then Cleveland's a distant third.
So let me go down another spot or two on the board. The Patriots at 6 won't be looking quarterback, obviously. They made their pick last year with Drake May. But the Jets, right now, as it stands, would be 7th. And certainly there are no signs that the Jets are going to be falling out of the top 10, given the way they've played. They fired their GM this week, Joe Douglas. It's a mess there. No idea, and this is getting way too 50,000-foot worldview, probably, but no idea how close Woody Johnson will be tied to the situation.
Right.
He could end up on some sort of appointment back across the pond, right? He could be Ambassador
Best case
Johnson
scenario
again.
for Jets fans.
Yes, absolutely agree. But there's also the possibility he'll remain closely tied to the situation, continue to try to ruin it as best he can, which only Ambassador Johnson can do. What is the Jets' plan? Do you get a sense that they would they have any interest in moving up to get in the quarterback market in the top 5? Or does this need to be more about, and hopefully for Jets fans' sake, doing this the slower, more methodical, more deliberate way of, hey, let's build our offensive line first, because that's what we need to do for whenever we do find our quarterback, and let's let the Aaron Rodgers storm just sort of run its course for another year?
No, I would be out on Aaron Rodgers. I was I'm not right often, but I never felt good about Aaron Rodgers going to New York being some sort of magic potion to solving all that ails that team. He's 40 years old.
Yeah.
My colleague Pete Prisco joked yesterday that do you think that Aaron Rodgers called Joe Douglas into his office to fire him? Because, he's basically running the outfit over there. And there's just so much dysfunction. I don't know if it makes sense to wait. you got it wrong with Zach Wilson, but everyone was on the Zach Wilson train and fell for that. And I'm not going to begrudge Joe Douglas for that. They needed a quarterback. The same reason they went out and probably got over their skis with the Aaron Rodgers situation. But if you love one of these guys, you need to go get him because, as I mentioned, the other plan is Justin Fields. And if I'm Justin Fields' agent, I'm like, I would not go to New York. It will make your career worse. If you thought Chicago was bad, buckle up. So I think that you have to trade up. And perhaps the Sanders are willing to overlook the dysfunction to be in that media market if that's something they're thinking about, as opposed to Cleveland, for example. But there's just this team is just Joe Douglas did a lot of good things. Brees Hall, Sauce Gardner, Elijah Bear Tucker. I mean, they're guys that he drafted. Just if you get the quarterback wrong, whether it's Zach Wilson or Aaron Rodgers, you're sort of screwed, and that's where they find themselves. He was in the last year of his deal too. I just think Woody did him a favor by letting him clean out his office ahead of Thanksgiving as opposed to wait until January.
Yeah, and he'll be out there on the market maybe. We'll see what happens. But there are definitely more front office moves to come in lots of places, maybe including New York, when the season ends. One last thing I wanted to ask you about how it affects the top of the draft. And again, Travis Hunter, widely regarded as not just number one on everybody's big board talent-wise, but the guy who will go first overall. Especially if it's Jacksonville sitting there, if things continue to sit that way. And I imagine Tennessee would be a spot for him as well. But whoever, if it's one of those two teams that ends up number one or number two, there was scuttlebutt thrown out there earlier this week about the idea of the Jaguars going after Bill Belichick. I can't imagine Bill Belichick has a ton of interest in going to Northern Florida, but I also know that Shad Khan has enough money to make it happen and make it attractive, most likely, and that if he's got a relationship with Trent Baalke, that part we know exists from years ago, granted, but it exists. What is the realistic idea? Is it realistic, I guess I should say, to imagine Bill Belichick going to Jacksonville to try and get the most out of a young quarterback? Trevor Lawrence is still, I guess, technically young, who they've committed to financially, and also sort of build things up around him and sort of set a tone. At the same time, Bill Belichick's in his 70s now, and I don't know how long he's going to be interested in doing this.
Right. So he wants to break John Shula's record. And by the way, he's retirement age, so North Florida is right in his wheelhouse.
That's true.
The other thing is this: how much does he want to share the general manager duties with Trent Baalke? Trent Baalke is very good at keeping his job, right? So sometimes it comes at the cost of those folks around him. And I don't think I'm saying anything out of school. That's not a huge secret. Yeah. So a couple things that you hit on there. If you're moving on from Doug Peterson, and that hasn't happened as we're speaking, but that this team is certainly going in the wrong direction, I'm not sure that keeping the general manager around solves the bigger issue, right? He's the guy that's drafting the players. Exactly. And some might say, driving a wedge into the organization, or at least creating factions. He's not, I liken him to Littlefinger. That's where I come down on this. So you got, if you walk into the room, you got to find who Littlefinger is first. That's the first order of business.
Yes.
I don't think he's making the organization better, is the bush I'm beating around. And I think if you're Shad Khan, and who's an incredibly smart businessman who has struggled to put together a consistently good football team, maybe wholesale changes are the way to go. And I don't know if bringing in a 70-plus-year-old guy who's going to be around for a year or two gets you the long-term direction you want to go. Ben Johnson makes sense. Bobby Sloak, the guys that are offensive-minded that can get the most out of your quarterback. The defense has been terrible, and Bill Belichick can address that. But Bill Belichick's also the person who thought it'd be hilarious to let Matt Patricia call plays for Mac Jones.
Right.
So you got to keep that in mind. And it just doesn't make sense to me. I know Bill Belichick wants to coach again. I don't know if there's a situation where it makes a ton of sense in an organization that's trying to rediscover itself over the long term, not just over the next year or two.
One last thing before I let you run, because I've kept you long enough, Ryan. I noticed your most recent mock from earlier in the week, after we get through some of those skill position guys at the top, Hunter, Sanders, Ward, Tetairoa McMillan, the wide receiver from Arizona, it does pivot quickly to the offensive line and defensive line and edge. You get a run of 5 straight picks at those positions. I and you're much better at the mock drafting thing than I'll ever be, but I threw one up at draftnation.com just the other day that was a little bit more skill position heavy. I guess this is more a global question about this year's talent pool and whether you feel teams are going to look, because it feels like it's deeper on those offensive and defensive lines and defensive edge spots than it is at the skill positions, at least in the first round or top half of the first round. Do you see that playing itself out? Or do you think what very often happens on especially the first night of the draft, we get to that Thursday and there's a run on skill and the offensive line, defensive line, edge guys maybe leak down the board a little bit, even though they should be going higher than some of those skill position guys?
So last year, the first 14 picks were all offense, 6 quarterbacks. Leatu Latu was the first edge rusher, defensive player taken at 15 to the Colts. That will not be the case this year. The last few mock drafts I've done, I've had 12 to 13 offensive players going and 13 to 14 defensive players going. And offensive line, actually, there's not a lot of depth early on. You're going to get 2 tackles, and then you're going to be squinting to get a third or a fourth. Savanea out of Arizona has a chance to be a first-round pick, I think. He'll be borderline, but he probably moves inside to guard. He's played left tackle, right tackle this year. And there'll be a couple other guys to keep an eye on. Connor Williams, the right tackle out of Texas, is raw, but he has upside. Simmons, the left tackle out of Ohio State, I think he tore his ACL, so he's done for the year. Hopefully he comes back, but he's a first-round talent. Ursary out of Minnesota is another guy to keep an eye on. But on the other side of the ball, especially the front 4, edge rush, defensive line, there's some dudes. And there could be 8, 9, 10 dudes that are drafted in the first round because of their abilities. Abdul Carter, who you know, is a crazy person, and he's just sort of scratching the surface on playing edge because he was off ball in prior years. James Pierce out of Tennessee is another twitched up athlete who probably weighs 10 to 15 pounds less than Carter, but he plays about the same weight in terms of how he gets after it. And then the interior defensive linemen are going to be sort of fun to watch as well. There'll be some cornerbacks, some guys that suffered injuries that'll be coming back from that, but have first-round talent as well. But wide receiver, not deep. Tight end, I think Tyler Warren has a chance to sneak into the first round, which is fun because I had him as a day 2, day 3 guy coming into the season. And he has been 98% of that offense at Penn State, and they have 2 really good running backs as well. So that's going to be the interesting thing to watch. It'll be less offense heavy, and I'm sure the narrative will be driven in the media about how it's not as sexy as in years past, and perhaps it won't be. I haven't gotten through everyone, obviously, but I don't have a ton of first-round grades right now. Certainly had more last year. So that's when it gets fun between picks 22 and 32, how teams decide what they want to do and allowing teams to trade up or whatever.
Well, I'm looking forward to, like I said, the continuing evolution of what goes on with the Sanders family and how it affects everything at the top of the draft. The always ridiculous exploits of both New York franchises. And, of course, whatever may or may not happen in Cleveland, all at the top of the draft. And we didn't even mention Vegas there, but we love checking out your mock drafts and all of the information you have at cbssports.com. Follow him on social media at Ryan Wilson CBS. Thanks so much for going on the clock with us here this week on Draft Nation, Ryan.
Good to see you, Chris.